completely silent instead.
Exactly. It's inhibiting.
We can keep talking. I'm fascinated with the writing process. I've never seen any two writers do it the same way. We've hosted many writing conferences at Book Passage over the years, and people get up and they talk about, I get up in the morning. This is when they're writing books. I get up at 7 and I write for 4 hours, and I take a break, and then, and I think, okay. And I do that every day, and I think, okay, that's great for you if you got a lifestyle that will permit that, and you got a mind that works that way. Then I hear people get up and say, I just kind of sit down and write when I get the inspiration to, and it may be any time of day. So it's just different ways of doing it.
Yeah, I found it's really, having 2 little kids was kind of like, you just write
whenever you can.
When they're not there.
Yeah. So I was lucky that I was able to do most of it. I was able to do most of the writing, and I was able to get my first full manuscript in before the pandemic and my first round of edits. So like, that was.
How old are the kids?
4 and a year and a half.
Oh wow, so you're in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a full-time job right there.
Yeah. So basically we had our second about only like 4 months before my manuscript was due. So I took like a couple weeks off, and then I took like 2 weeks off as like paternity leave to like not write, and then started that up again. But that was definitely easier to write during that time than it would have been if I'd had to do all my writing starting March 15th.
Yeah, God.
But you were probably in that same boat. I mean, you were in that boat. Like, you were writing most of it after it started.
Yeah, I wrote most of the book. I mean, my kids were a little older, so that helped. But yeah, it's not a huge house. I honestly wrote most of the book on my bed, because my wife. This is my home office, but it's basically been my wife's home office since the pandemic started. So it's a little touch and go there for a while.
My son and daughter-in-law are in the same situation. My son is a lawyer with a tech company, and his wife is an investigative reporter. So anytime he has a meeting online with his team, he has to go up in his bedroom, lock the door, because she's downstairs, and would probably be tempted to write stories
about it. Yeah. That's great.
But we're trying, and my wife and I are trying to run a bookstore basically out of our house. I have an upstairs office. She has a downstairs office, and we just do what we can. It's a whole different experience.
You make it work,
as you can well imagine.
Yeah, I think to your point earlier, though, Brad, I do feel as though for me having kids was completely changed my relationship to time. Like, I just became much more efficient about work because I'd never had that experience of okay, you now have 55 minutes to work. Go.
Right.
That's it.
Listen, we probably ought to officially introduce the event and get going here. I could talk to you guys all night about writing and about the whole experience, but I just want to welcome our audience here to Book Passage and thank everyone for being here. This is a really interesting book that we have a discussion tonight, and I've been talking to Brad and Patrick for a little bit before we went on air, and it covers a topic that the Japanese internment during World War II. I was telling them that when I was growing up, it was a bit of history that was completely covered up. It was simply not mentioned in the California public schools. I'd never heard a word about it until I got to college and realized that taking a course involving Supreme Court cases, where I saw I think it was a Korematsu case talking about the internment of Japanese, and I thought, what in the hell was that? And it just shows you how much history can be lost if you don't pay attention to it, and if you're too, in the case of probably white Americans, we're just simply too embarrassed or too whatever to even discuss it. So the fact that a book like this can come out and can give some depth, humanity to what Japanese Americans went through during that period is amazing. Eagles of Heart Mountain is actually the odd thing about it is the entree to it is football. You would never have expected it when talk to me in the abstract if that would be the thing that would be the motivating factor here. But as our two guests will discuss, it was the ability to play football that the young men in the camp had, the ability to play it well, opened up doors that allowed them to get into the outside world, basically. Brad Pearson is a former feature editor with Southwest Magazine. He's the author and has clearly, from our discussion, I can tell, not only did a lot of research on this, but done it in a way that he humanizes the characters. These are characters you'd find in a novel. He's being interviewed today by Patrick Keefe, who's a writer with New Yorker magazine and the author of Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland. I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm going to turn it over to them, but I'll probably see you at the end. And hopefully, we can take some of your questions. And I'm really looking forward to a wonderful discussion. Again, welcome to everyone to Book Passage. Patrick, you want to take it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And thanks to Brad Pearson for joining us to talk about his fantastic book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain. I want to thank Book Passage for making this happen. It's obviously been a brutal year pretty much across the board, but I think particularly for independent bookstores. And I've been amazed and heartened by the degree to which independent bookstores have managed to keep alive a community of readers, even across the wires, through the screen in this way. And so really happy to be able to take part in this kind of discussion. And I hope that you'll all think about them and buy this book. There is a link, I guess, in the Twitch chat. I think there's a link to buy the book from Book Passage, which I hope you'll do. So there's opportunity to do that. You can also, if you have questions for Brad about the book, his research process, anything that we talk about here, you can put them in the chat session on the Twitch. And I think what's going to happen is eventually those will come to me and I'll read them aloud and we can get into it. So let's talk about the book. It's a fascinating book.
Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Patrick and Book Passage for having me.
It's an amazing book, Brad. It does a lot of things that are really hard, and it makes them look really easy, which is really something. There's, on the one hand, it is a book about football. It's an inspiring book about a football team. On the other hand, it's this penetrating and extremely dark look at one of the most shameful episodes in US history. And I wondered if you could just tell us, for starters, a little bit about how you came to this. I understand you were in Wyoming reporting another story and just stumbled across the story of the Eagles.
Yeah, it's kind of, basically you nailed it. So I was in Wyoming in 2013, just basically to write a feature about Yellowstone for Cowboys and Indians magazine, which is a magazine that's based in Dallas that is a magazine in the West. And I was there, and some other folks that I was with were going to go to the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. And I said, okay, yeah, sure. Like that sounds great. And I thought I had a base knowledge of what, at that time I called Japanese internment. I thought I had a base knowledge of what was going on. And then I would walk in and say like, oh yeah, this is interesting. And I walked out and was just completely floored and embarrassed by how little I really knew about this chapter, not only, from 1941 to 1946, but Japanese American history in general. And, the racism and xenophobia of the events that led up to incarceration. So while I was there, there was one really small passage on one of the displays that talked about the Heart Mountain Eagles. And that really just sort of it sort of stuck in my head. I went home and I wrote the other story, and then a year passed, 6 months passed, a year passed. And then I just couldn't get this sentence about this football team out of my head. And that's when I started sort of digging in a little bit about learning more about incarceration in general, and then figuring out who the players were and how good this team really was.
So I want to ask you about the difference in terms of how we classify this. You know, you mentioned that you had referred to it as internment, but now would say incarceration. But before we get to that, I mean, it's fitting in some ways that this conversation is being convened by a California bookstore, right? Because so much of the prehistory, the story of just the Japanese presence in America earlier in the 20th century is a California story. I mean, it's a story about the West. And I mean, there was so much in that part of the book that I hadn't known, but I mean, maybe you could just talk a little bit about how in large numbers, the Japanese first came to the West Coast, the role they played in the economy. I mean, the whole thing about strawberries was wild to me. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so basically, you know, like most immigrant groups in the United States, they came for a specific opportunity and with a specific skill set. And most Japanese that came to America were from a farming class. So they had this skill and they had this ability, and they first used it as laborers in sugarcane fields in Hawaii. And then when immigration opened up more broadly to the mainland United States, they used those farming skills and basically said, okay, you know, we'll start out as sort of laborers, we'll start out as sharecroppers, and then eventually, like, oh, why don't you start paying us just a little bit, but just pay us with the land that you don't want, or let us rent a few acres here and there. And white ranchers and farmers were happy to do that and say, okay, if you want this old rocky field, or you want this, you know, fully logged piece of land, like, go ahead and take it. And basically the Japanese just used centuries and generations of agricultural techniques to come to completely dominate many, many industries up and down the West Coast. So the berry industry, asparagus, cantaloupes, lettuce, all sorts of different things, the flower market in Los Angeles County. And that obviously they reaped financial rewards for that, but at the same time, they were battling these white farmers who immediately regretted their decisions and were incredibly jealous of the success that these Japanese farmers had, and basically saw and took every opportunity they could once they realized that Japanese immigrants were basically going to take over agriculture on the West Coast. It took every opportunity they could legislatively and politically to try to eliminate them from California, Washington, and Oregon. And that's sort of, like you said, like, I think about, everybody thinks about Pearl Harbor as like the event that sort of set off Japanese American incarceration. And while that is true, that was just the final thing that finally gave everybody in the country sort of the political will to actually do something that politicians and farmers and ranchers and various agricultural groups up and down the West Coast had wanted to do since 1900.
Well, and I mean, one of the things that was really surprising for me, and which you demonstrate so vividly in the book, is when you do get Pearl Harbor, and then subsequently Executive Order 9066, which is sort of what gives rise to this incarceration. You demonstrate that it's totally irrational from a security point of view, right? That it's not actually that the policy solution grows organically out of the threat, right?
Right. No, yeah, there's no, it's the opposite of that. And that there's all these intelligence reports that have been running up and down. You know, the federal government had spies in the Japanese and Japanese American communities for decades. And all those spies would find was that the Japanese Americans and even the Japanese community in America would either A, be loyal because they were Americans first and foremost, or B, be, quiet. So all these intelligence reports that came out of Southern California and even came out of Hawaii basically said, we're good, like nothing's going to happen. And anything that might happen, we could isolate folks on a case-by-case basis and deal with it like we would deal with any other saboteur or espionage, and just deal with it person to person, as opposed to having to send 120,000 people to a camp. But again, like you said, it was easy to ignore that when decades of history had just asked for a moment to be able to get rid of the Japanese and the Nikkei in America.
Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, because that was another thing that was really striking to me, was just that in the immediate aftermath, like the days and I guess maybe weeks after Pearl Harbor, there's actually support for the Japanese American community, that it turns, like it's not an instantaneous thing. Can you just sort of narrate a bit how that shift happens?
Yeah, so right after Pearl Harbor, pretty much a lot of folks come out. The Attorney General comes out, Eleanor Roosevelt, a lot of folks come out and just say, hey, these are Americans, these are our neighbors. We need to treat them with respect. The same thing happens in the Los Angeles Times does that. All newspapers up and down the coast sort of say, newspapers that had honestly previously been asking for the removal of Japanese for the decades prior said, these are good people, these are our neighbors. But then pretty quickly, things changed. And there were a couple different, there was Walter Lippmann, there was a Hearst columnist, and there are a lot of folks that were in the media that really started stoking, took the political will that came from some of the more racist elements on the West Coast and started channeling those and really started broadcasting just a lot of disinformation. And that's,
It all sounds so unfamiliar to me.
I know. Yeah, it's surprising. Like it's the past month of American history hasn't been repeated any other time. But it's one of those things where, yeah, I mean, and it was, it wasn't just kind of vague things. There were very specific threats that especially in the LA Times, that they were saying that they were finding radio transmitters, that there were bombings, that there were submarines off the coast sending signals, that there were Japanese spies in the hills that were signaling with mirrors to submarines and ships off the coast. That, there were very specific stories that ran on the front page of the LA Times that just had no basis in fact whatsoever. And that really ended up stoking a lot of fear on the West Coast that eventually spread to the Army, and the Army and the War Department were in on that stoking to begin with. And then it just became, a loop of like one person would say one thing that was more ridiculous. And then they'd say, oh, well, obviously like the War Department feels this way. And then obviously Hearst newspapers feel this way. And then it would just kind of snowball from there.
And I was fascinated. I mean, I guess I knew this intuitively, but I hadn't really thought about it, that you don't get anything near this level of alarmism, much less incarceration attaching to the Italian American community or the German American community during this same period of time.
Yeah, you don't get that. And that, you could pretty easily, just adhere that to racism. But at the same time, you also don't get the same level of incarceration for Japanese that live in Hawaii. So like, it's not even, they don't even apply this broad executive order to people that presumably in their minds would have been the most dangerous of Japanese that are in America, which are folks that live in Honolulu. I mean, Hawaii had a huge Japanese population at the time. So that just sort of shows.
You chalk that up then to it being kind of effectively like a proxy for economic anxiety?
Yeah, but then also the other thing they have to think about with Hawaii was that so much, there were two separate things there, and that there's a military commander that ran the West Coast that was separate than the Hawaiian military commander. And basically the Hawaiian military commander just said, no, these people are fine. And basically a lot of industry would have completely collapsed if they had removed Japanese labor from Hawaii. So it was a lot of labor that was still being used by white sugarcane and pineapple plantation owners. So it was harder to remove Japanese American labor from Hawaii than it was from the West Coast, because at the West Coast, you were removing your competition, and then you could swoop in and buy their farms that they had actually made arrogable for the past decades. You could buy it for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah. Oh God. And so then tell us about the kind of the fraught semantics here. Tell us about, I mean, generally the term you hear is Japanese internment, and why that strikes you as inappropriate, and why you made the decision to use incarceration and not, for instance, concentration camp. I mean, it's funny. I was talking to my kids, saw me reading the book, and they were asking me what it was about, and as I was telling them, they said, "Oh, so a concentration camp." I mean, that that was what they went to. Tell me about the naming and why it's significant.
Yeah, so when I first started reporting on the book, I sort of checked myself. I was like, okay, and I thought about this probably every day for the last 3 years. but you're not, I had to tell myself, like, you're not Japanese American. This isn't your story. So pretty early on, I leaned heavily on a couple different organizations, and one of them was this group Densho in Seattle that it's a nonprofit that sort of tasked itself with the preservation and the education of Japanese American incarceration history. And I turned to them for terminology and said, okay, in the Japanese American community right now, what do you all consider this? Like, what's the terminology that your community uses to describe what happened during World War II? And Japanese American incarceration was the one that they use, and they do use the term concentration camps. And I use that at the beginning of the book, and I don't avoid it for any reason. But like you said, like, there is, since World War II, the term concentration camp, even though it does apply to what we're talking about here, has come to just be synonymous with extermination camps. And I mean, even during the war, Roosevelt was calling these WRA camps concentration camps. So the terminology didn't really shift until after the war. But for me, it was just really important to use the terminology that the community has been using, and that to sort of respect the community that allowed me to tell this story.
So it's interesting. I had this question for you later, but now that you broach it, perhaps we can talk a bit more about it now. I'm fascinated. I mean, 10 years ago wrote a book about Chinatown in New York City, and about the immigrant experience coming from Southeast China to the U.S. And I think I probably had a similar set of worries and concerns that it sounds like you did, just about who am I to tell this story? Is there a way as an outsider to tell it with integrity and a level of fidelity that would hold up for the people that the story is about? And I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more. I mean, in some ways, I was wrestling with those issues 10 years ago, and in some ways, at that point, these types of questions about who gets to write what story, and at what point are you trespassing, were much less, they were being talked about less then than they are now. I just wonder if you could talk through a little bit of just your own, what the third rails were for you, what your concerns were going in, and how you resolved those, as you approach the project.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. Like, that's, it's exactly that was exactly my concern going into this, was saying, like, okay, this is not my community at all. Like, I am not Japanese American. Like, I've never been, I grew up in New York. There's not a large Japanese American population in New York. Like, there's lots of things where I just, and I was pretty ignorant to the actual history itself. So what I told myself after I found the story, and at that point I didn't really know what it was going to be. I didn't know if it was going to be a feature or a book or a dead end. And I told myself that I would not do the book or do the project if I didn't have the sign off from the families that I wanted to feature in it. Because I figured pretty early on that, like, and not only from a storytelling standpoint, but from a respect standpoint, where I didn't want to go into a project and, this wasn't I investigated a lot of things, but it wasn't an investigative piece where I felt like, I was looking at something and trying to dissect it in a way that some other stories I wouldn't have felt bad about not contacting the family or whatever it was. But pretty early on in the project, I basically reached out to one of the main characters is a player by the name of Babe Nomura. And yeah, and Babe died a while ago. And so I found his family, and I found his daughter, and I found her email address. Her name's Jan Mori. And I just sent her an email and said, you don't know me. You don't have to respond to this email, but I want to talk about your dad. He seems pretty great. And she, Jan and I have talked about this a lot since then. And I still don't think either of us really understand why she agreed to talk to me or be the person that, told her dad's story for the first time in real length. But she did. And then she sort of opened up the gates to lots of other families and sort of talked to them and said, hey, Brad seems legit or isn't going to screw this up completely. And then it was honestly just a ton of work, reading and things like that, but then just really trying to become a part of this community that I want to tell the story of. At Heart Mountain specifically, they have a pilgrimage every summer in July where survivors from the camp and their families come back to Wyoming and spend 4 or 5 days together. And there's lots of different programs and speakers. And even before, like right after I talked to Jan, I was like, I should probably book a flight out to this. And that was in 2017. And then I've gone every year since while I was working on the book. And then after I had wrapped it up. And it was important from a reporting standpoint, but it was also important for me to say, hey, I'm here. I'm not just going to jump in and leave. Like I'm not parachuting into this, and I'm not just going to, this isn't something for my ego. Like I really want to tell the story and tell it in a respectful way, in a way that honors the Heart Mountain community, but then also honors the wider Japanese American community. And that was something that I struggled with. I think I said earlier, probably every day since I got the book deal, was that there were times where I would just wake up in the middle of the night and just be like, oh, I'm going to screw this up. Like I'm going to screw this up in some way or another. And, I did something that I don't think I've ever done before with a feature or any other project I've worked on, where after the first draft was done, I sent it to some of the family members, the folks that I wrote with, and just said, hey, if I've gotten anything wrong here, not just factually, but tonally or culturally, please let me know, because I don't want to get that wrong. And then we could talk through what those changes might be. And it ended up just being smaller things, not big, broad picture things. So I was happy with that. But it's definitely something I struggled with for a long time. And like you said, it's definitely in the moment. I really started working on this in earnest right after Trump was inaugurated. So I feel like those conversations have really come to the fore, and rightfully in our profession and in the country in general, about who gets to tell what stories. And it's something I'm still not entirely, like if somebody came up to me tonight or tomorrow and said, I don't think you should have written this, I wouldn't think that they were wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel as though, yeah, I mean, for me, it's it's so much in the approach that you take, right? I mean, this is to my mind, you have to kind of earn the right.
Yeah.
And you do that on a, interview by interview, page by page basis. But I feel as though your humanity just really comes through here in the way in which you capture these people. So there's so many rich characters, but because you mentioned him and because he's one of the best, tell us a little bit about Babe Nomura.
Yeah. So Babe was basically, he was like an all-American kid. He grew up in Hollywood. His parents owned a boarding house in Hollywood, and he grew up there and imagine the best athlete that you went to high school with, and that was Babe. So he was an amazing baseball player, a great basketball player, decathlete in middle school. And then, back in the 30s and 40s in LA, the way that most Japanese American athletes got into sports was through the Nisei Athletic Union, which was a Japanese American league that was all up and down throughout California. And that was how Babe got really initiated into sports. And pretty early on, even as a 14 and 15-year-old, he was playing people in their 20s in baseball and softball and just making citywide all-star teams. And then in high school, he decided, okay, well, kind of if I want to really prove myself, I gotta play football. And he was the only Japanese American player on the Hollywood high school team, the years that he was on the team, and he became the starting running back, and then got sent to a camp. So it's like, you have this guy who is on the starting running back at a high school that is probably the most famous neighborhood in America. Hollywood high school, he had movie stars around him all the time. And then one event happens and all of a sudden he gets sent to a horse track in Santa Anita, and then gets sent to a camp in Wyoming in the middle of, the Wyoming desert. So it's, he's this fascinating character that eventually later on I won't give too much away, but really uses his athleticism to make a name for himself across the country. And he's not a super brash guy. He's a quiet, kind kid that sort of takes people under his wing. And that's how him and George Yoshinaga, who's the other main character of this book, really become friends. Is that Horse grew up in Mountain View as the son of strawberry farmers, and Babe grew up in Hollywood, like actual Hollywood. He lived right off Cahuenga, and somehow they came together and were sort of an odd couple. And they're both, you say both, first generation Japanese Americans, but they created this friendship that lasted until they both died in, decades later.
One of the things I found so heartbreaking about the book was that it is this, it's a story of exclusion and stigmatization on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a story about assimilation, right? Like the sense in which these American-born kids actually are kind of doing everything they can to be as American as can be. Like the idea that it's football is the sport in question, the fact that the team is the Eagles. There's a sort of if it was fiction, it would almost be too on the nose.
Yeah, and that's something that, like you said, like these details that pop up, and I think to myself sometimes, like, fiction writing seems too hard because coming up with these sort of details would seem too trite. Like but then the football thing is what really stuck out to me when I first saw the display at the museum years ago. Because like you said, you don't think of Japanese Americans as dominating football players. And, I mentioned a little bit in the book, but baseball sort of came of age in America and Japan at the same time. So when Japanese immigrants came to the United States, there was no learning curve there in terms of being good baseball players. They didn't need to learn a whole new sport to be able to be just as good as their American counterparts at playing it. But football was something that was very, very different. And some of those leagues popped up and down the West Coast as early as the 19 teens, football leagues that were Japanese immigrants, Chinese immigrants. But even on a high school level, you still, even throughout LA, which had the biggest Japanese American population in mainland US, most high schools only had maybe one Japanese player at most. And that is what sort of makes it so extraordinary, is that the Eagles, the first season, out of the 40 kids that came to try out, only 3 of them had ever played high school football before. So you have these kids that, like you said, are these assimilated American kids, so they understood the game at least a little bit. And then basically the school athletic director just said, look, if you're a good athlete, come on out and maybe we'll put together a football team.
Yeah. And can you, the evocation in the book of the Heart Mountain Relocation Center is amazing. I wonder if you could just paint the picture for us a little bit of what this place was.
Yeah. So basically, it's on a super inhospitable piece of land east of Yellowstone. It's land that had been passed over for millennia by other people. There had been no permanent settlers in that part of the Bighorn Basin. Different tribes had passed through, but there had been no permanent settlements there. And it was because it was a terrible place to live. Like it was cold. It was crazy cold in the winter. It was incredibly hot in the summer. It was just dusty as hell. There was no vegetation, or there were no trees. There was vegetation, but it was all just sort of scrub brush. And Buffalo Bill Cody tried to put in an irrigation project there to bring water to the whole land and bailed on it and had to have the US government bail him out. So the place was just, and that was the thing with all these camps, is that they were built, the federal government basically put them on land that they saw as irredeemable at the time, but then hoped that with the WRA labor that the Japanese Americans would provide would turn it into land that they could then sell or use. So, it was the prospect of prison labor. I don't get into it too much in the book, but that was basically why the federal government picked the different pieces of land that they did.
And then the origins of the team. I mean, the idea that these kids who were otherwise just kind of sitting around, right? Getting fat on potatoes.
Yeah. Yeah, so the first fall, in the fall of 42, is when the camp opened in that August, and that year was just a complete mess. Like they had no textbooks. There was one-room schoolhouses where there was one furnace for 50 or 60 kids. So the kids in the front of the classroom would be down in t-shirts, and the kids in the back would be in wool coats and hats. So there was no sports. There were no school sports that first winter. But then, excuse me, that first fall. But then basically the school and the camp itself kind of realized that if we don't find stuff for these folks to do, or we don't let them do things that they want to do, we're going to have a real problem on our hands from a management standpoint. So the camp starts to loosen some of their regulations, or at least the way that they oversee some of the incarcerees. And that leads to, in that first winter, they play a couple basketball games against a couple neighboring high schools, and just get their clocks cleaned, just get annihilated, like 50-20, just get run up and down the court. But then over the summer of 43, that was when there's a full school year was coming up, and they got a new coach, they got a new athletic director from a different high school in the state, who had really good connections with the Wyoming State Athletic Association. And that sort of got the ball rolling. And that was when they decided to put together a football team. And at that time in the state of Wyoming, there was, as there is in Wyoming today, football was really, really popular. And not only that, but there were a couple different styles. There were 6-man games, there was the regular football that we know. So basically they just saw an opportunity to have something for these high schoolers to do. And that was how the team came together. And they had, in between their first day of practice and the first game was 13 days. So they basically had to teach everybody but 3 players how to play football in 13 days.
And I mean, talk a little bit about one of the things that's surprising about the story is is that this is not some rec league within the relocation center, but they're actually interacting with the surrounding community to a degree that probably a lot of the other people who are in the camp are not afforded the opportunity to. I mean, just talk a little bit about that, sort of how that came about, and how we can understand what the average folks in Wyoming made of this this detention camp that is set up in their midst.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things you hit on there that are important in that. So Heart Mountain was set up between 2 small communities, about like the 2,500 person town of Cody, and there were about 1,500 to 1,800 people in Powell. So they had these 2 communities that were in Northwest Wyoming, pretty isolated, that they put this camp in between. And the communities liked having the camp there for economic benefit, because they sold their dairy there, they sold their sugar beets there, they sold their hardwood or their hardware store stuff there, and sporting equipment to the camp. But then, of course, they hated the fact that they were Japanese. So it was, they hung signs in the town that said, Japs keep walking, like no Japs allowed in this barbershop. Because there was, after a little bit, some folks were able to get passes to go into town to do things, basic things that need to be done for work in Heart Mountain. But then the football team actually, so some of the other teams, so the high school basketball team and a few other clubs were able to go to neighboring white high schools and play their games and do events. But for whatever reason, and I was never able to figure out why, the football team was never allowed to play their games at opposing schools. So every one of these white high schools had to come into the camp to play the games, which, I didn't want to do. Like in the writing of it, I tried really hard to kind of fight against that both sidesism that we sort of fall into sometimes. But there were moments where I had to sit back and think, like, if I grew up in a town of 1,800 people and it was 1943, and I'd never seen a Japanese or Japanese American person in my life, and all of a sudden I get dropped on a football field, go through barbed wire, there's armed guards, and all of a sudden there's 5,000 ethnically Japanese people mining a football field trying to watch me play. I often thought about like how intimidating and how just profound that must have been for these kids that were coming from these small towns that had no idea what they're getting into, and definitely had no idea that they're about to get their ass kicked as soon as they got on the field.
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting to hear you say that about not wanting to do the both sides thing. And I'd be curious to know why. I guess, I mean, maybe you could tell me that specifically, but I'm also just curious about how you conceived of the book. I mean, it's you mentioned earlier that you didn't know if it was a, you know, a magazine piece or a book or a dead end. And it's fascinating, right? Because you have the, you know, we don't get any football until halfway or more than halfway through the book. And yet it works. And I think in some ways the football is, at least for me as a reader, it was important because it was, there was hope there.
Yeah.
And so much of the history is actually so bleak, really. You know, I wonder if you could just sort of talk about your own conception of like what this book would be, which stories you were going to tell. There's so many characters who you meet briefly, and then others who you spend more time with. And then, as you suggest, you know, you're not following the local kid in Wyoming home. So just talk a little bit about those choices.
Yeah, I mean, I think I realized early on that, like you said, you know, there's some football stuff in the first 3 chapters, but then it goes silent for a while. And that was just a matter of the timeline. You know, it was hard to be like, okay, how can I get this story from A to B to C to D when I know that factually, like, there's just not football in this year that exists in the middle of the book. So that was when I kind of leaned a little bit more heavily on, that was when I realized in my reporting that I needed to like create these characters and place them in the historic moment. So that was when, like, even when I would go back and tell the story of Japanese American life leading up to it, I would sort of go back to some of the characters' parents when they were coming over and sort of show what their lives were like and why they made the decisions that they did. Even if that was just for a paragraph or two to sort of remind the reader that, okay, we're in 1920, but Babe's dad just got here. And this is, or, 1926, now Babe and Horse are being born in this moment when Los Angeles is starting to grow, or, whatever the historic moment is, to try to like keep the reader invested in the character, knowing that it's going to take a little while to get back to them as the main driving force of the book. So that was, but that was not something that, if you look at my book proposal, is in there.
Yeah.
Because it's the thing where, I mean, I think once I started doing all the research and realizing how much the story was driven on the racism that led to the racism that came the decades before, that I had to tell that part of the story to give people this fuller history of why, the weeks that happened after, like I said earlier, that Pearl Harbor was just this sort of triggering event that, that lit all of this powder.
Oh, but yeah, I mean, I think those are incredibly effective choices because to me, there's a shorter, more kind of overtly inspirational book you could have written that would be more of a, more of a sort of, like the movie of the week football story.
Yeah, Remember the Titans version of.
Yeah, totally. Which, but what is fascinating? I mean, I think what's so useful about having all that history is that it makes once you really get into the football, it invests it with a level of meaning that wouldn't be there if we didn't fully understand how it is that all this came to pass.
And that was part of why I did it too, because I thought that it really helped ground the choices that these kids had to make later on, right? The choices about whether to join the army
Oh,
or
I
to,
want to ask about this. Yeah.
or to resist the draft, where you say like, okay, without the history, and you show like what the real treatment of Japanese Americans had been for decades before, I don't think that writing this book without including that history, I don't think that the draft resistance stuff is as whenever I was writing and reading about that, that was what really I guess angered me the most about the whole process, was the reinstatement of the draft for Japanese Americans during the war. And I think that was because I had spent so much time seeing how much this country had just kicked this community for decades and decades and hoped to get them out of here. And then when they needed bodies in Italy and southern France, they called on them from behind barbed wire to go save them.
So to me, this was the most, I mean, so let me pause just quickly on one program note here. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'm not seeing any questions yet, but now is the moment. If you have questions for Brad, hit us up, put it in the chat box. It'll come through to me. Speak now or forever hold your peace. To me, this was probably the single most striking thing in the whole book, was this astonishing thing, which you've just alluded to, and maybe you could talk a bit more about it, but the idea that having told these people that their identity as US citizens wasn't enough to keep them out of a prison camp, that Uncle Sam then comes and says, but oh, by the way, we'd like to conscript you in the military effort. And the dilemmas, I mean, the kind of range of responses that people have to that, from those who, I mean, it's like amazing almost any way you slice it, right? Like, it's amazing to think that having gone through all that, you would then sign up,
Right.
Voluntarily. It's also amazing to look at the people who resisted, and then there's like a trial. I mean, talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, that was the thing that really struck me, was that, and these are in short form, what happened is that pretty quickly after the camps opened, the US government, even though they already knew this deep down, realized that there was, very little military reason to actually keep people in the camps. So then the War Department said, you know what, we could actually use a few bodies here in Europe. So they tried to get volunteers to join, and they had really pretty abysmal volunteer numbers, especially coming out of Heart Mountain, to join the war effort, to join the army. So then the government said like, oh, okay, well, we'll just draft them now. So then at the beginning of 1944, you have the federal government reinstates the draft for Japanese Americans, which it had not only halted, but it actually classified Japanese Americans technically as aliens. So it sort of set them in this weird group that said like, okay, am I an American or am I an alien, even though I was born in Los Angeles or Seattle or San Diego or whatever it is. So then in Heart Mountain especially, but it spreads to the other camps too, you have a really, really fervent draft resistance movement, that people start hosting draft resistance events and meetings all throughout camp. They have these crazy meetings where they jam barracks and mess halls with hundreds of people, smoke phone, everyone's just smoking cigarettes, and the smoke's kind of billowing out of these barracks when they try to plan and say, what are we going to do? So they try to force the federal government's hand and say, just let us out of the camps, or, and as soon as you do these things, we will gladly join the war effort because we are Americans and we want to fight for America. But if that means that you're going to keep our sisters and our moms and our dads and our grandparents behind barbed wire while we fight, we're not gonna stand for that. And that was a really interesting part when I started researching and realized that A, the timeline lines up with the football seasons, but then B, that if you're a high school senior and you're on the Heart Mountain Eagles football team, you're the people that have to make this decision. You're the person that at 17 or 18 has to say, where does my loyalty lie? And not only that, but am I loyal to my family? Am I loyal to my community? Am I loyal to my country? And how do I rank those things? And some folks showed that loyalty by resisting. And, the thing that I find so fascinating is that a lot of the draft resistors, as soon as they got out of jail, after being jailed after the war, joined the army and fought in Korea. And, they basically told the US government, we are loyal Americans. We're Americans. Just take us out of these camps, or like, make sure that we actually are technically Americans, and we'll go and fight in Italy. We'll go and fight in France. And the people that did fight in the 442 are the most highly decorated unit in American history during the war. I mean, there's murals of them at the Pentagon, so it's really confounding to look at how the government treated the Japanese American community at whole, but then especially when it came to the draft and what they asked these young men to choose.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Okay, so we've got some questions here from our audience. Can you talk about your source material? How do you balance 60-year-old, sometimes second generation memories with archival material in recreating specific events?
Yeah, that was tough. A lot of my main sources here were if you look at any of the games or a lot of the Heart Mountain, the way that stuff is sort of structured, that's due to the fact that the Heart Mountain camp had an incredible weekly newspaper called the Heart Mountain Sentinel. And it came out every week, it had a great staff, and it had a incredibly robust sports section. So every week that the football team would play, there would be gamers, there would be previews of next week's game, there would be box scores, and there would be a column that sort of dissected the week's game and the week coming up. So that was how I built out a lot of the football stuff. But then, like you allude to, I was only able to speak with one living Eagles player. And that was great. And it obviously like really, really drove the story forward in some ways that I hadn't seen it driving it forward. But then I was lucky in that in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of grad students that took oral histories from folks in the camps, and a bunch of my players had done oral histories. And those are kept at the Heart Mountain Archives in Wyoming, and then also with Densho, the group that I had talked about earlier. So I had really, really extensive interviews through that oral history with Horse, and then Stanigawa had done one too, and then Teizo Matsumoto had also done one. And, those were done, most of them were done decades ago. So the folks, they weren't done in 1947 or 1948, but you still had people that were in their 50s for the most part when they were doing them, maybe sometime a little bit later, that had really great memories and just really vivid storytelling. So those were two of the main things. But then the National Archives has still to this day, if you were in a WRA camp, the National Archives has your personnel folder from your time in camp. And so if you're alive right now and you were in a camp, you can go to the National Archives and request your own file, or your parents' files if they've passed away. And that was what I did for every player and a lot of their parents too. So that helped sort of give me a sense of what they were like as students and what they were like when they were filling out loyalty questionnaires and some of their injuries that they actually sustained on the football field. I was able to see that they went to the doctor after they went to this game and they broke their leg or whatever it was.
I should say that the football scenes in particular just really sing. My dad played college football, and I played football all through high school just to appease him. I hated it. I hated it the whole time. And when I was done, I quit my senior year after 5 years, never played again, don't watch football. This book actually made me nostalgic for football in a way that I have not been since roughly 1994, which took some doing. Brad, do you see any similarities between events going on today and events in your book?
Yeah. Well, it's, like I had said earlier, that I really started working in earnest right after Trump was inaugurated. So it's funny because people would always say like, oh, wow, like you're writing about this, like in this moment. But the thing is that like the thing that they would compare it to would always shift like year by year in the Trump administration. So at first it would be like people compare it to the Muslim ban. And then people compared it to family separation and like kids in cages. But now, like in the past month, what I've compared it mostly to is just how much disinformation has sort of flooded the country and has sort of soured so many people's minds. And that's the thing now that I think about the most when I think about what the similarities between, 1941, 42, and the similarities to 2000 and whatever year, 2021. And that's the thing I think about the most now in terms of how easy it was to turn public opinion and poison a lot of people's minds with misinformation. And we saw that, my book came out the day before the insurrection on the Capitol. So you just look at how that crowd was fomented from the top down, and it's not dissimilar to why 120,000 Japanese Americans ended up in a camp.
Yeah. So we are out of time. I'm afraid there are a few more questions we probably won't get to. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative and ask one final quick one. Has Hollywood optioned this book yet?
No,
Not yet.
not yet.
I hope it happens soon.
It's in the works right now, but if you're watching, there's still time to get in.
Fantastic. So. Well, thank you so much, Brad. And I'll turn it over to others, but this has been a great pleasure for me. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much for doing this, Patrick. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Book Passage for having me. I know that things have been really tough for bookstores. So especially as a first-time author, it's really great to still be able to do something despite the pandemic.
Thank you both very much. I have to say, this is one of the most informative hours I've ever sat through. Almost every topic you went on was a little bit of a revelation, added something to the knowledge of this period of history. I'm just really impressed. Thank you for your comments about Book Passage. We want to sell your book. People can come to the website and buy it. We want to sell as many copies as we can, and they really, really are in for a treat, because anyone who's listened to this will get some sense of the depth of this book. Brad, Patrick, you're marvelous together. It's just the interview back and forth just went like nothing I've quite seen. And it's as bad as it is for a bookstore to not be able to have live events in the store. There are times when having an event online like this and having the audience from around the country kind of makes up for it a little bit. Anyway, we're trying to do our best with it. And it was this event today just was wonderful. And I would hope all the audience take look at our website, check out some of the events coming up. There are lots of them happening. And we really look forward to seeing the viewers again. And thank you again for both of you for being with us.
Thanks so much.